Midnight's Children is the second of Salman Rushdie's novels, but even to call it a novel in a way is an error. Modern novels had plots, and unless history is a plot, God forbid, this work is not easily classifiable in that genre. It is restless in the extreme, part history text, part autobiography, part social theory, part poetry, part magic, part realism, part fable, part allegory, part Bollywood showbiz, and part lyrical epic. It is, with the other of his works, a new species of narration. It is pluricultural and multivocal, and responses to it continue to vary from the embrace of critics to the hostile. Rushdie, I am convinced, is clearly guilty of the sin of polyglottony. Salman Rushdie has trained his traveled eyes, those of an expatriate, on one of the most convulsive events in modern history, the partition of India and Pakistan, a moment of idealized hope and simultaneously a moment of immediate extreme violence. He authored the continuing story with fascination and provocation, while dreaming of an unlikely redemption for refugees everywhere. This is a parable and a metaphor for peoples of developing countries today, as well as those within fully developed countries with failed or even failing democracies. It is a story which is always urgent and never more so than today. I would like to turn this afternoon over to our instigator and ally in this venture, President Lee Bollinger, who had the vision and the fortitude to enable this large project to speed forward. It is his good grace that has allowed the many complexities of this challenging work to emerge to everyone's benefit. Join me in pleasure and in honor in welcoming Salman Rushdie and Lee Bollinger.
Thanks, Bruce. So we're just going to have a conversation. None of this has been rehearsed. We have not gone over this. Salman says that he loves unrehearsed life, and we're going to do our best to make it as good as we possibly can. And I'm interested in really pursuing, I think, some of the great issues of the time and how your views as a novelist and writer and public figure sort of speak to these and how you think about it. Now, I have to begin with this question. Don't you sometimes wish you were a lawyer?
Well, you know, I was supposed to be a lawyer. That was my father's plan. My father was a lawyer. He was qualified as a barrister in England, and clearly thought that that's what I should do. I didn't. And when I left college and mentioned to him that I was thinking of wanting to be a writer, this kind of yelp came out of him. Which was completely, he wasn't trying to be horrible, but he couldn't help himself. He said, "What will I tell my friends?" And, well, I mean, having said that, after that, he was supportive of my trying to start out. But it's not, you know, it certainly wasn't the plan. I mean, I think, you know, actually, I think I'd have been quite a good lawyer. That's always been my hunch. I mean, I like arguing.
We'll wait to see till the end of this interview. So I think one of the ways to frame this is the fact that this is your second appearance at Columbia. And the first appearance was a really dramatic entry into Low Library on December 11th, 1991, some 1,000 days after the death threat against you. And this was the first public appearance that you made since that death threat. And it was very dramatic, and it was on an occasion of the celebration of the First Amendment. And Justice Brennan was to be the honoree, and you were the special guest.
I was the surprise guest.
You were the surprise guest, and nobody knew until that moment, really, that as you walked through a curtain, that you would be there. And you received a standing ovation. And you gave a speech which I want to refer to because you say a number of things in there that I think are very revealing, sort of about you and about life and about great issues. And so if we could, I'd like to start with that and then end with sort of where we are now and use that as the time frame. And in a sense, this was sort of a birth. I know births are very important to you metaphorically and fictionally. And in this particular birth on December 11th, 1991, the talk that you gave was, if I were to use one word to describe sort of the impression that you created in the audience, it would be that you were feeling a sense of abandonment. That here you were living in complete isolation, and terrible things had happened to you, and meanwhile, friends had turned against you, as well as strangers. Things were being said about you that were extremely painful. And while you were also finding reason for hope, there was the sense that the rest of the world was going on about its business, and you were being treated as, you described it at various points, as somebody in a bubble, unable to have real human contact, and sort of outside. And this, you concluded with, again, a metaphor of a balloon. You started and concluded. And how you were sinking in this balloon, and people should, in a sense, reach out to you to help. Is that, I mean, this is your interview. I'm sorry to go on for so long, but it's a powerful sort of theme. Is that consistent with how you felt at the time?
Yeah, that was, I mean, it was a very bad time, you know, and it was probably the worst time, actually, because as you say, until that moment, I hadn't really been able to begin to fight back. You know, I'd really been kept somewhat against my will out of the public eye, and not, and you know, for a rather long period of time, hadn't been able to fight my corner. You know, and that feeling of helplessness is very distressing. You know, and actually from that moment on, it kind of changed, because I did begin to do that and immediately felt better. It was an amazing thing coming to Columbia that time, because everybody got very excited, the police, you know. And I found myself being met with an 11-vehicle motorcade, with me in the middle vehicle, which was a white armored vehicle, right? So, and all the other cars were black. You know, I'm in the white one. so it's a very big neon sign in the sky. And the police officer who was in charge of the operation, I believe to be certifiably insane. And he was, I will identify him only as Lieutenant Bob. He had, you know, he talked into his sleeve a lot. And he was known for the day as Hudson Commander. That was his name. Roger, Hudson Commander. Wilco, Hudson, look out, yes, Roger, copy that, you know, all that. Right. And so there we are. I mean, actually, my literary agent, Andrew Wiley, who was with me in this vehicle, said it was the greatest day of his life. You know, streaking down 125th Street in an 11-vehicle motorcade with the whole of Harlem on the street, and going like this. You know. For me, it was less pleasant, but I'm glad to have brought him some pleasure. I said to Lieutenant Bob, Lieutenant Bob, this is a lot, you know. He said, it's what we do for Arafat. At this point, I found out what it's like to be Yasser Arafat in New York, you know. And I said, supposing it was the president, you know, what would you do for the president? And he said, well, sir, for the president, we'd close down a lot of these side streets here. But in your case, we didn't want to do that because we thought it would look too conspicuous. It was just crazy. You know, there were snipers on rooftops. I mean, it was... But then, as I say, from that point on, I did feel able to begin to, to begin the kind of political and intellectual fight back against that threat. And actually, to be true, you mentioned that I lost friends. Actually, I didn't lose that many friends, exactly. In fact, I had somewhat the opposite experience of my friends coming much closer to me and actually making friends as a result of the threats against me. There were some writers who broke ranks. I mean, they're really surprisingly few, actually, but I can count them all on the fingers of one hand, mostly. John Berger, John le Carré, and they've still got some fingers left over. There were very few writers who Roald Dahl, children's writer.
I know. Thanks.
Yes. Fascist, anti-Semite,
right.
Dead person. Anyway, he was nasty. But actually, the literary community on the whole was astonishing in its solidarity. Given that the literary community in general is not noted for its solidarity, you know what I mean? That it's quite a separated, individualist and even infighting and rivalrous community, But in this particular case, I think because people could see that something serious was at issue, they actually did unite. But abandonment, you said. Yeah, I mean, politically, certainly, that was a moment where I felt nobody really had any energy to solve the problem. And that it was much easier to sweep me under the carpet and hope I went away, And that's one of the reasons it took so long. I mean, interestingly, when the governments changed, when there stopped being a conservative government in Britain, and first Thatcher and then John Major were replaced by the Labour government, the Blair government, and when the Bush 1 was replaced by Clinton here, it really did change everything, because suddenly in both countries there was a political will to resolve the matter. And as a result, rather rapidly it was resolved. And what it showed me is that it could have been done years before, if only anybody had bothered to do it. But I mean, I remember coming shortly after that Columbia visit. I was able to go to Washington to speak at a free speech event there. And during that time, people tried to arrange political meetings for me at the George Bush Sr. White House, and completely failed. And that memorable figure, Marlin Fitzwater, announced that he saw no reason why President Bush should meet me, because after all, I was just a writer on a book tour. And that was the kind of characteristic attitude of that presidency. But it changed dramatically when Clinton came to power.
So let me just pursue that for a second. I don't want to be too somber about this. But when you read the talk that you gave, it has a solemn, very abandoned sort of feel to it. I mean, you talk about that your life, that this had been a degree course in worthlessness. And I'm wondering about the relationship of humor and these feelings for you. And I'm interested in them, in how it translates into your writing and into your, because I think, there's a strong sense in reading your writings and in listening to you that it's somehow that combination of really deep issues and personal things, of personal deep feelings, and a sort of very airy, humorous sense of the world as well. And would you say that's right?
Yeah, I would say that's right. And I think, yes, I'd forgotten having written that thing about the degree course in worthlessness. And it strikes me, as you quote it, that I obviously was in quite a depressed frame of mind, to have written that sentence and said that sentence. But it was partly because it's hard to remember now because thank goodness life isn't like that anymore. But at that time, everybody had an opinion about me. I mean, everybody. Mm-hmm. The opinion was not based on knowing my work or having met me or having heard anything I'd said or seen me on television or, you know,
Right.
it was based on nothing, you know, and yet everybody had, you could have stopped, you know, a taxi driver in the street of any city of the world and said, what do you think of Salman Rushdie? And he'd have had a point of view, you know. And that was an alarming thing to feel.
Right.
You know, just how did that happen? You know, and many of those views were negative.
Right.
And what was being published in the newspapers was, in many cases, and I'm not now even talking about a kind of Islamic attack. I mean, that's one thing, right? Or an Islamist attack.
Right.
That's one thing. But just at the level of newspaper commentary, there was, people get tired of saying, poor guy, he's in danger.
Right.
You know, that very rapidly, people start looking for another angle. And the interesting angle is, what did he do? You know,
Right.
as my English teacher, they dug up my old English teacher from high school, who gave what I consider to be the best quote of the whole thing. He said, who'd have thought such a nice, quiet boy could get in so much trouble? And, well, he's wrong about nice, quiet boy, but never mind. It was horrifying, horrifying to have my character reinvented for me every day, 20 different ways, to have my motives described for me in ways which I didn't recognize, to have my integrity questioned almost by the minute, to have my, you know, my writing torn to pieces in front of my eyes after, you know, 15 years of working as a writer, to discover that suddenly you had no money in the bank. You know, that you'd been, I mean, the Static Verses was my fifth novel, my fifth book. And so it wasn't that I just sort of arrived from nowhere, you know. But it seemed as if I had. It seemed as if nothing I had done before existed.
Right.
And there was just suddenly this thing.
I mean, this is one of the things you said. After describing really the horrendous sort of conditions that you had been subjected to, you sort of ask yourself the question, isn't there something, you may think there's something I could do about this. So here's the paragraph. You may ask why I'm so sure there's nothing I can do to help myself. At the end of 1990, dispirited and demoralized, feeling abandoned, that's probably where I got the word abandoned from, even then in consequence of the British government's decision to patch things up with Iran, and with my marriage at an end, faced by deepest grief, my unquenchable sorrow at having been torn away from, cast out of the cultures and societies from which I'd always drawn my strength and inspiration, that is, the broad community of British Asians and the broader community of Indian Muslims, I determined to make peace with Islam even at the cost of my pride, which I want to get to. But I mean, that certainly conveys as very powerfully a sense of dislocation and abandonment. And when you think about you think about Midnight Children, you think about the partitioning, you think, I mean, how much of this is of sort of critical importance to your view of the world?
Well, I think it falls into the category of be careful what you wish for.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because I think clearly the subject of dislocation, migration, fracturing, etc. I mean, it's what I was writing about, you know, long before any of this happened to me. You know, I mean, in Midnight Children, when the doctor at the beginning falls in love with this woman who he sees only in bits through a hole in a bedsheet, that, in a way, that fracturing of the woman, you know, and her assembly in his mind over a period of time, bit by bit, you know, he kind of glues her together in his imagination and then falls in love with it. That was, in a way, also a figure of how the whole book was constructed, you know, as the world seen in fragments, you know, and then in some way united by the imagination of the writer and also of the reader, you know. So I was, that in Shame, there's a whole riff in there somewhere about, when I remember John Fowles has a sentence in one of his novels in which he speaks about how the only thing that matters is what he calls whole sight, you know. And he says, if you don't have whole sight, then all the rest is sort of meaningless. And I remember when I read that, sort of wanting to argue with it as a sentence, you know, because it seemed to me that one of the things we don't have anymore is whole sight. You know, the world has become too fragmented and disputed a territory for anybody to be able to claim to see everything, You know, that kind of Renaissance man idea of being able to have the whole of knowledge at your disposal,
Right.
you know, is no longer possible.
Right.
I mean, partly because there's too much knowledge, and partly because it's too argued over.
Right.
You know, we can't even agree about what is the case, you know, anymore. So it seemed to me that against that Fowlesian idea of whole sight, I wanted to invent a kind of broken mirror, you know, a kind of fractured reality.
Yes.
And to see what those pieces could show us. And then, you know, and then it happened to my life. So of course, you know, it was a very scary thing, because one of the ways in which, I can't remember if it was in that essay or elsewhere, but it felt like somebody broke my picture of the world. You know, and we all live inside a picture of the world,
right.
which is how we think things are, you know. And if somebody smashes that, one way of describing that is insanity.
Yeah.
You know, if you don't have a picture of the world, you're sort of crazy.
Right.
You know, and you have to begin to put it back together. You know,
Right.
and that's what I had to do in those years.
Right. So one of the things that you speak to then and now, and it just makes me extremely happy to hear you talk about it, is freedom of speech. And you have a statement in here which I mean, it's just wonderful. You say at the end of your talk in 1991 that free speech is a non-starter, says one of my Islamic extremist opponents. No, sir, you say, it is not that. Free speech is the whole thing, the whole ball game. Free speech is life itself. And I wonder if we could talk about that a little bit. That is, why is freedom of speech? What made you think that freedom of speech is the whole thing? And I guess the larger frame in which I would like to sort of pursue this is that a hell of a lot of the world does not think that freedom of speech is the whole thing. And one of the great issues of our time is, to what extent will sort of Western values be insisted upon or imposed upon other societies in the world that do not accept those values? And liberalism has a kind of, and free speech has a kind of paradox in it, because a lot of what freedom of speech, liberalism is about is having a very active imagination, being able to put yourself in other people's positions and so on. I mean, that's the basis of tolerance, and that's the basis of a lot of what we take to be Western values. And yet there are some things that we think we should insist upon, and one of those is free speech. The very thing that has as its core sort of trying to understand other points of view is something we're not prepared to give up on. And that means, at the end of the day, we sort of have to have an argument for why that kind of value is something that we should insist upon. And you take that position. Free speech is life itself. It's the whole ball game. It's the whole thing. And you, as one of the most powerful symbols in the modern world of the denial of free speech because of the death threat, have a really a sort of an unusual perspective, it seems to me, on the importance of that. So what I'd like to invite you to do is to talk about why free speech is the whole ball game, why it is life itself, why it is something that we should insist upon.
Yeah. How long have you got? It's just on the subject of the death threat. I just thought, you know, in parenthesis, it would be worth saying that that was one particular battle, hard as it was to fight, that in fact we did
Right.
win.
Right.
You know, that they tried to suppress a book. The book was not suppressed. They tried to suppress the writer. The writer was not suppressed. It's
Right.
still, it was a difficult battle. And I say we, I mean, lots of people,
But there were
publishers, writers, readers.
But a lot of people paid big costs, including you especially.
Nevertheless, it was good to win because the alternative was to
absolutely.
lose.
Right.
And just in the matter of me
Right.
and the Ayatollah Khomeini, one of us is dead. But just that's in parentheses over here. Right, free speech. That was an example of free speech. Here's what I think, first of all, why it became, I mean, you're right that I was obliged to learn about free speech as an issue
Yeah.
by the process of somebody trying to take mine away. And I think that's not that unusual because, when there's enough air to breathe, it seems ridiculous to be carrying around placards to say how it's important to have air to breathe.
Right.
Because you've all got it. So what's the story? What's the subject? What's the beef? It's when somebody starts turning off the air supply that you suddenly notice that it's pretty important to be able to breathe. And you start making a noise about it. And that's really, I felt, what happened to me. Somebody started turning off the air supply. And I became suddenly extremely conscious of what I had previously just taken for granted. I mean, the going-in position writing the Satanic Verses was that this came out of material that was my life material and which belonged to me as much as it belonged to anyone else, and that I had a perfect right to approach it and write about it and explore it any way I chose. That was the going-in position. There were clearly people who disagreed with that. But that made me, first of all, aware of how automatic that going-in position had been, and the kind of strength of questioning that it then came under. Because you're right, there's plenty of people who don't think like this.
Right.
And I guess I'd give you a theoretical and a practical, and a kind of, as it were, circumstantial answer. I think the theoretical answer is, and why I said, the whole ball game and life itself and so on, is not because of what you call Western values, because I don't particularly think of free speech as a Western value. I think it's something which everywhere I've been in the world, people enjoy indulging in.
Right.
And don't like it when they're prevented from doing so. I've been in Pakistan during military dictatorships. People didn't enjoy that. I've been in India during the Indira Gandhi emergency. People were very upset about the censorship, and they didn't feel that they were responsible.
So you think freedom of speech is a universal desire?
I guess this is the thing. The question of whether there are such things as universal values. Is there such a thing as a human value which is not culture specific? And my view is that one way of approaching that question is to look at our actual nature as human beings. And what is it that is required for us to be the beings that we are? And since one of the things we are is, as far as we know, the only self-conscious creature in the world, the only one that is actually able to discuss itself, to imagine itself, and to have ideas about itself, and so on, it is very important for such a creature to be able to go through that process, which is a part of its essential nature. We're also, as far as I know, unique in the world as being storytelling animals. Dolphins, as far as one knows, don't tell each other stories. Maybe they do. As Saul Bellow once said about something else, I'm waiting for the great dolphin literature. And then, so the case is not proven. When I say storytelling animals, I also don't just mean that we write stories. I mean that in a way we define ourselves by stories. And an example that I sometimes use about this is the family. Inside a family, there are family stories. Knowing the stories of the family is an important part of belonging to the family. And these can be very weird family stories, which you don't tell outsiders so much, and when people join the family, either when a child is born or somebody marries into the family or whatever it may be, gradually they are told the stories of the family, and when they know those stories, they are members of the family.
Right.
You know, and in the end, you know, inside the family, when we die and generations move on, in a way, what remains of us is a story. You know, we become part of that group of stories. So, you know, so we are people who exist in stories and by stories. Personally, I'm not talking about what writers do. I'm talking about what individuals do. So, given that so much of our deepest nature centers around the idea of self-discussion and of description through story, if somebody tries to control that by deciding how you may speak and what you may speak about and what is permissible and not permissible, we simply, in my view, cannot be ourselves. You know, and that's why I think I would offer it as a human value and not as a culture-specific value. You know,
but some stories that people tell are very offensive to other people's stories.
Yeah, that's okay.
That's all right.
That's okay. I mean, I'm offended by all sorts of stuff. You know, I mean, lots of stuff. It doesn't mean you have to shut them up. You know, and this is where, let me say, because this is the other thing I was going to say, which I think answers the question. The practical example,
right.
thing that happened to me after the Khomeini fatwa in Pakistan was that there was a movie made about me, a movie called International Guerrillas. And the International Guerrillas were a kind of proto-Al-Qaeda group who were the heroes of the film and whose job was to assassinate me. I was the bad guy. I was dressed in a very villainous series of kind of cerise safari suits. And the camera always started at my feet and panned slowly upwards. So there was a lot of safari suit. Very offensive to me, just as a fashion note. Anyway, I, meanwhile, in the same film, was shown living in what looked like, you know, the Philippines, guarded by what looked very like Mossad. You know, and I had a whiskey bottle in this hand and a whip in this hand, or sometimes a sword. And there's a moment of high unintentional comedy in the film where one of the international guerrillas is captured, you know, by the Israeli Secret Service and is brought to my island paradise and is tied like this between palm trees. You know, and then I, you know, whip him and you know, I torture him with my scimitar and you know, drinking whiskey while I'm doing it, and in my cerise safari suit. And when I've done that for a while, you know, when I've slaked my bloodlust, I say, or the character playing me says, take him away and read to him from the satanic verses all night. And he goes, not that, anything but that. Anyway, at the end of this film, in fact, I do get killed. So, you know, it's sort of, I get killed by a divine intervention, like a thunderbolt. Anyway, I get fried. So the film, you know, very offensive in many ways. And when it came to England, well, they tried to bring it to England, and the distributors went to get a certificate for it. And clearly, what's called the British Board of Film Classification, the censor's body, were given legal advice that the film is sort of 19,000 ways defamatory, and that if they gave it a certificate, I could sue them as well, because they would become party to the defamation by giving it a certificate.
Right.
So they refused it a certificate. I then come into the problem that I'm fighting a free speech battle. I'm being defended by an act of censorship.
Right.
So I had to write a formal legal letter to the British Board of Film Classification, foregoing my legal right of suing. Said, I will not take a lawsuit out. You must give this film a certificate, which they eventually did. And the producers booked very big cinema, so 2,000-seat cinema in the town of Bradford in Yorkshire, which is the largest Muslim population in Britain, and nobody went. Just nobody went. Nobody wanted to see a bad movie, you know. And I mean, had that film been banned, it would have become a hot video. Its power would have been multiplied.
Right.
And it was a wonderful, to me, demonstration of the free speech position, which is that people are actually able to make up their own minds. That you can just put the stuff out there, even if it's offensive to you, you know, etc. And people, broadly speaking, have good sense. You know, even if they're being told something about me, which they might in a way sympathize with, they still don't want to pay, you know, $10 to see a rubbishy movie. And so, I mean, that broadly speaking became my view. Let it be there. You know, let it be there. The best way of arguing with it is if it's out there.
Right.
You know, ideas don't cease to exist because you suppress them. They're still there.
So let's come back to that. Let's take the next sort of subject, which is very much related to that, and one of the, again, great issues of the moment and of the time, and that is the relationship of religion to political and social life. And I think many, let me just put it in a more personal sense, I think there is I have the sense that religion is, in any event, put it this way, there are very serious problems we are facing in the world from a too close connection between religious beliefs and political life. And I would like to ask you to reflect on that because, again, this is very much a matter that you have written about, thought about a lot. In the talk at Columbia in 1991, you say that you were very much committed to a secular Muslim kind of view of the world and life, and you're very concerned about the risks of the sort of actually existing Islamic culture, religious culture moving into political life, as you called it. What do you think about that?
Well, see, as background, to come from an Indian Muslim background,
right,
has two aspects, because of course Muslims are a minority in India and not a majority community. So that's a different experience than being in a country where Muslims are the majority or indeed are the whole population almost. So, and in India, the Muslim community always, from a very early point in the nationalist movement, accepted secular values because those were the values devised by Nehru and Gandhi as a way of protecting minorities, you know, from the 85% Hindu majority. And it was believed that if the Constitution of India were to be in some way religious in character, i.e. affected by the very large Hindu majority, that would be extremely destabilizing for community relations and so on, and therefore the country should be secularist in order to protect minorities, of whom, of course, the Muslims are by far the biggest minority. I mean, roughly speaking, 100 million Muslims in India, roughly speaking, 850 million Hindus, and roughly speaking, you know, 50 million everyone else. So very, very big minority. And so if you grew up in an Indian Muslim family, you were quite naturally secularized. It wasn't a big subject. And certainly, you know, in those early years, first 25 years of Indian independence, when the Indian Congress Party more or less had the political support of the Muslim community, it was a very secularized support. So there's that. I mean, the other thing is that I grew up in a family without much religion, just, you know, at the ordinary level. My parents didn't seem to be particularly religious people, and I'm grateful to them for that. Because it just let me off a particular hook, you know. And it was, well, how shall I put this? One of the strange things to me, and I've discussed this with writers from all over the Muslim world, really, writers from Lebanon and Egypt and Syria, etc. And one of the things that we've been saying is if you look at the cultural life of the great cities of the Muslim world 50 years ago, you know, look at it in the late 50s. Look at Beirut, great city, great cosmopolitan city. Look at Damascus, Tehran, Lahore, you know. These were great cities with vibrant cultures. They were open cities. They had a culture of discussion and argument and disputation and etc. What happened? You know, what happened? This is, and okay, we can blame superpower politics for a share of that. And of course, that's so, you know? But that's not the whole story. You know, this is a story of cultural decay, which you can't escape if you look around. What these cultures were half a century ago and where they are now. You know, just I'm talking about culture. I'm not
Right.
talking about, you know, economics or politics. I'm talking about how people live in a place.
I understand.
You know, and these were tolerant, open societies in a way that, so in my lifetime, that decline has been, in my view, shocking. You know, I mean, having said that, religion and politics, that's not a subject exclusive to Islam.
Absolutely.
You know? I mean, last year I was, for mysterious reasons, invited to Washington to address a group of Democrat senators and a group of Republican senators about, you know, the present discontents.
Right.
I mean, at that time, Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and so on. One of the things that really struck me as a difference, cultural difference between the Democrats and the Republicans that I met, was that the Republicans spoke more or less entirely in religious language, more or less entirely, you know, and that was a surprise, you know, that it was so overtly a language of religious war. You know, I don't mean an actual war, I mean religious conflict between cultures. I remember one of the senators saying to me with real anger that the thing that really annoyed him about Osama bin Laden was that Osama bin Laden said that America was a godless country. He said, how can he say that? He said, we're incredibly godly. I said, well, Senator, I guess he doesn't think so. But so it struck me then that what was happening was a religious conflict on this side of the fence too.
Right. I think that's absolutely right. I think everybody, there's fundamentalism in this country, and it takes all different religious forms, as it does around the world. But I guess the question to be asked is, at this point, is given the turmoil that the world seems to constantly be drawn into, which has these religious sort of connections, and where free speech and other civil rights are disputed, and you point to a kind of innate desire for openness and tolerance and a life that reflects that. Do you think there is also an existential need that is not met by that kind of life?
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
and that there's something in, whether it's paradoxical or whether it's explicable or what, but I mean, it's not simply a world where there are enlightened people with commitments to freedom of speech and secularism and so on, and then the rest of the world that somehow just doesn't quite get it.
I don't think it is.
Life is built, a lot more complexity in this, and there are deep existential needs on the other side too.
Absolutely. Do you? I mean, reason is not enough.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I myself feel the word spiritual should be outlawed for about 50 years, because it makes me think of naked Californians on mountaintops, you know, chanting in Tibetan, you know, in order to be in touch with the cosmos and so on. You just ban it, you know. So much for free speech.
Right. I was going to. Believe me, I caught it. So go ahead.
But I think what's different is this politicized religion. That's a religion with the backing of highly organized political movements, which, you know, after all, when they take charge in various countries, have been shown to be, first of all, not representative, and secondly, catastrophically bad at doing the job. So in those countries where religion has actually taken over the government, you know, Taliban, Afghanistan, you know, Khomeiniite Iran, it's a catastrophe. You know, I mean, look at Iran. Iran, before the Khomeini revolution, I mean, you know, and I hold no brief for the Shah, by the way, you know, one of the world's great bastards, and the you know, and the British and the Americans fought, you know, the Shah. So I mean, I'm not trying to be, you know, what I sometimes hear being called a Persian, the Shah faction. You know, they're always Persians. After the Shah, at the time of the change, the time of the Khomeini revolution, Iran was a net exporter of food to the region. It was an extremely wealthy and developed economy, one of the most developed in the third world. It had a very powerful trades union movement. It had a highly developed feminist movement. It had a broad range of political parties, starting from the Communist Party and going to kind of free market capitalism on the other side. It had a very highly developed educational system. All these groups joined to depose the Shah.
Right.
And without all these groups combining, the Shah would not have been deposed. Right. And the tragedy of Iran is that Khomeini ate the revolution. Right. That he basically destroyed all those people who had brought him to power in order to impose a very narrow society. And since then, Iran is an economic basket case. You know, a whole generation has been wiped out in a kind of useless war. There are food riots because instead of exporting food to the region, there's no food in the shops for people to eat. The economy is a catastrophe. Right. So they can't run the country. Right. And that's, of course, why in Iran now they're very unpopular.
Now, but if there is this sort of existential tension, I want to pick up on India and the sort of secular state of Nehru and a kind of state socialism versus the movements of the past decade, which are representative of changes throughout the world, and that is the sort of globalized free trade. Yeah. And the question is, are you concerned on this kind of striving to resolve these tensions we're talking about? Are you concerned by what you see in societies that you know well, by the shift to a market-based form of life, so that free speech is life itself, and that's become markets are life itself?
Yeah, it's a big shift, as you say, because India came into being with a pretty protectionist economy, tariff barriers around, with a command economy, where the government made these 5-year plans, on a rather Soviet model, which the economy was then supposed to respond to, with a lot of stimulation from above. Things were done, like, for example, famously Coca-Cola was banned in India so that local cola drinks, could emerge. It became illegal to import foreign cars so that there could be an Indian motor industry. Right. And so on. Right. And that's how the country proceeded, yes, for 30 years, more than 30 years.
Non-aligned.
Non-aligned, and with a much closer relationship politically with the Soviet Union than with the United States.
Right.
In those days, the United States used to rather suspect India because of that Soviet connection, and in Henry Kissinger's phrase, would tilt towards Pakistan. That clearly created mutual suspicion between India and the United States, so a lot of which actually was dispelled with, at the time of the Clinton visit. So that was a beneficial effect of that visit. Anyway, and then there's this huge shift, huge, which is a shift that happened everywhere in the world too.
That's right.
The dropping of tariff barriers.
Right.
The result of that, I wouldn't say has been all awful. Yeah. Just look at one of the benefits. At that time, in the time of the command economy and the protectionist economy, there was very tight censorship of news media, particularly broadcast media. The print media were more or less allowed to function, but the broadcast, the radio, which everybody listened to, and television, as that became more important, completely controlled. Then along comes the Star satellite, Rupert Murdoch, right? Beaming down, CNN, MTV, et cetera, et cetera. Right. And suddenly, there was a way for people in India to receive news information, which the Indian state could not censor. Right. And it completely transformed the nature of the Indian media, almost overnight. Yeah. The ability of the government to control information vanished. Right. It vanished overnight. And of course, then comes the internet and exponentially increases that thing. So there's a sense in which there have been clear benefits. There's also been an enormous quantity of wealth creation as a result of stunning number of Indian millionaires. Really quite remarkable number of people of great wealth in India now. And those people are generating a very powerful economy now, and particularly in new technology areas and so But, I mean, Bombay, for example, was always a city of great wealth and great poverty. It was always, the slogan, the cliche in Bombay was was about the hovel and the high-rise, right next to each other. And that was always there. But now Bombay has unbelievable wealth.
Is this all on balance for the good, or you're troubled by it?
No, it's very disturbing because what it does is it has that gulf, that widening gulf between the rich and the poor, is the thing from which populist crypto-fascist politics has emerged elsewhere in the world, and that's where it comes from in India. I mean, if you look at the growth in Bombay specifically of the neo-fascist political party, the Shiv Sena, it grew entirely by understanding that the important thing was to work at the detailed grassroots level. If you went to the Congress Party and if you lived, you were a slum dweller, I mean, Dharavi is the biggest slum in Asia in Bombay. It's not quite what people might think of as a slum. I mean, it's got roads, it's got electricity, it's got some plumbing in various places, standpipes and so on, but people are living in shacks made of tin and cardboard, and in very dreadful conditions. If your standpipe stops working, there's no drinking water, nobody would dream of going to the Congress Party guy because he only comes round at election time, when he wants your vote. But the Shiv Sena guy would say, okay, and that afternoon there'd be a plumber around there and he'd fix the standpipe. Right. This is exactly how the Nazi Party started, exactly how. They understood that and learned that lesson. If you work at the grassroots level, you're the guys who are there and deliver. You start building a power base. Then they actually structured themselves exactly like the Nazi Party, and as using, I mean, Bal Thackeray, the leader of the Shiv Sena, famously would have a picture of Adolf Hitler on his desk, as a role model. So that's what happened in Bombay, and it's created a degree of communal tension that never used to exist there, and it's extremely worrying.
I have one more question, and we have to close. And I'm going to quote one of your statements. This is the optimistic side of your statement. A self-description in your talk at Columbia at Low Library in 1991. And the question, I want to read this, and the question is, do you still feel this is an accurate self-description? You say, yet I must cling with all my might to that chameleon, that chimera, that shape-shifter, my own soul. Must hold on to its mischievous, iconoclastic, out-of-step clown instincts. No matter how great the storm, if that plunges me into contradiction and paradox, so be it. I've lived in that messy ocean all my life. I've fished in it for my art. This turbulent sea was the sea outside my bedroom window in Bombay. It is the sea by which I was born and which I carry with me wherever I go.
So that's not bad, is it? Yeah, I mean, one of the things, I guess this is really the last thing to say, is that I think democracy, freedom, art, literature, these are not tea parties. These are not quiet, civilized locations. These are turbulent, brawling, arguing, abrasive things. You don't, a free society is not a society in which everybody meekly says, after you, no, after you, It's one in which people, I mean, in fact, on that level, isn't it good that people in New York have started being rude to each other again? I mean, that after you, after you, how are you doing, are you all right, all that stuff, that was, sort of bewildered. What's that about? Anyway, so I've always seen all these related things, democracy, freedom, literature, the world of the imagination, the world of the intellect, etc., as being turbulent places. And, out of that turbulence comes work, and, out of those sparks, fly, which are sometimes creative and sometimes not, but without that turbulence, in a calm sea, nothing happens. So, let's have the storm.
So, I want to say on behalf of Columbia, Salman, we look forward to welcoming you back in 2015, 12 years after this. Thanks very much for this. Thanks.